professor of political science at the University of Florida. I'm best known for producing the country's voter turnout rates. I've been doing that since the late 1990s. Those turnout rates are disseminated through the National Exit Poll Organization, and so they get piped right into the media. So as soon as you see the day after the election what the turnout rate was, at least our earliest estimates, that will be coming from me by and large. These turnout statistics are used very widely. Textbooks, policymakers, even the Minnesota Secretary of State uses it for their official turnout rate. In addition to that, I'm really interested in election data. So another big project I've been working on over the last few years is compiling precinct boundaries and election results associated with those precincts. That's used primarily for redistricting, although it has applications for political news coverage, for campaign organizations. So it's not solely just for redistricting, but just about everything that you know about redistricting in terms of the political ramifications was because of the very difficult data collection we did over the last 4 or 5 years now, and continue to do. Again, you look at who was using it. These were Supreme Court cases, like in Alabama. Redistricting authorities across the country were using our data. Media, all levels of media, and I can go on and on. So again, a lot of that data. Now, the other thing, again, I'm just a data nerd, is that I also, up to the run up to the election, I'll be tracking early voting activity in the country. And the website I've been doing this since like 2008. Again, this is really, I started this as a lark because the Exit Poll organization asked me to track it. And I said, I'll just post it online and maybe people will help me collect some data. So like 1 million visits afterwards. And, I realized I'd really struck upon something. And so I'll be doing that again. That website usually gets at least 1 million unique visits every cycle because people want to know what's going to happen. Now, I do use it to forecast what's going to happen in the election, but the primary purpose that the Exit Poll organization is using it for is to forecast turnout and get an idea of what the share of the early vote will be versus the election day vote within the states, so that we can have accurate election night forecasting on that outstanding vote that's still yet to be counted and reported. So it serves a really important purpose in that respect. But of course, people really want to know who's going to win the election. So I also have to answer a lot of those questions too.
Yes, always needing to predict. This is a good place for us to start the conversation because it's something I've been very curious about. I've been trying to get in touch with someone at AP Votecast about this as well. But talk about exit polling and how it works. I think a lot of people imagine that it looks kind of like the local reporter who's standing outside, the most populous precinct or something and just asking people as they go by. I think that is a little bit what it's like, but maybe you can talk a bit about how exit polls work and what they're for.
Well, first of all, let's understand the media do not call election results with the exit polls alone. They only do that in like a place like Utah or Alaska or Washington, D.C., some place where all the polling suggests like what's going to happen. They get an exit poll. It confirms with, what we believe is going to happen within that state. And so off of that, the media will call an exit a state one way or the other. But for all those places where there's even just a little bit of uncertainty about how the election's going to go, the Exit Poll organization, which divorced from the Associated Press a few years ago over data collection issues, disputes over that. Both of them are going to be collecting election results, and they're going to be modeling those election results. They're going to be correlating the election results with past voting election results within those states. And they're going to use those models, and there's more than one of them. There's multiple models, and you look at all of them, you troubleshoot them as best you can. You look for any anomalies, and sometimes you detect them. And then you go back through the system and realize, oh, was that like someone did a fat fingered data entry error, or that could be with the exit poll organization doing it, or it could even be with the election administrators. That's happened too. But it's that point where you looked at everything, you've looked at what's happening elsewhere in the country, you've looked at the exit polls, you've looked at everything, and then you feel very confident at that point. This is how the election is going to play out. So to go back to your original question, like what are the exit polls really for? The exit polls are to just give us a sense of what was motivating people to vote for the candidates that they voted for. It's not to call election results. And that's really, it's an unfortunate thing because as we, in like the hours before the election, we'll get the first kind of sense of the exit polls. They won't be the real forecast yet of what's happening, but there'll be some numbers in there about like what was motivating people and those sorts of things. And they get disseminated out and people start opining, oh, this looks really good for one candidate or the other.
Right.
And I'll tell you, all those analysts who are sitting in the room, myself included, when we're not looking at it that way, we're like, okay, is this right? And the other thing that happens is that eventually what will happen is that the exit polls will be weighted to the actual election results. So those early exit polls that you get are always unreliable because we don't have the actual election results yet to weight the exit polls to. And so it's only going to be after we get the last exit polls in, because there's still some exit polls that haven't been tabulated yet from the pollsters. It's only at that very end of the night, once we've weighted back to the actual election results, that those exit polls are actually going to tell us, the best estimate that we can get as to why people chose the candidates that they did.
I think that's really helpful because frequently the methods of all of this, everything related to polling and exit polls and measuring election turnout gets kind of boiled down as if it were a single source method of figuring things out. We did do a conversation with David Ratliff from Clarity Campaign Labs, who was talking about modeling turnout quite far in advance. And I think this gets me to my follow-up question too, which is about this relatively new. I mean, I'm from Oregon, so it's not new to me. I live in New York now, but it's still not new to me. Vote by mail, but the wider spread use of early voting, same day voter registration, and vote by mail is something that I imagine has created some interesting work for people who are doing turnout models, since it's not the same as everybody showing up at the polls on the one day.
Yeah, the early voting actually is great for modeling turnout as we get close to the election. Like right now, I don't know. I mean, we have some polls about enthusiasm. There's some disparities among those polls. I look at those numbers and I generally think, all right, so we're probably going to have a turnout rate that's very similar to the turnout rates we've been having since about 2008 or so. So north of 60% of those eligible will participate is my guess. And hear my words, that's my guess. There's really no good way to estimate this in any way, like using a model and trying to do that. It's just my gut impression, having looked at these data for a very long time. I don't think we're going to be as high as the 2020 election because that was a very unusual pandemic election that drove turnout in some very important ways. It doesn't, again, my vibes or my feelings don't tell me that we're going to be at 2020 levels. I could be wrong. Something could happen between now and election day. But what we'll really know is once we start getting those early voting numbers in. And so places like Oregon, which are all mail ballot states, Colorado, Washington, and then there have been a host of other states that have since joined. The first three that started doing early voting are all mail ballot elections. We're going to get a very good sense of what the turnout is. By election, the day before the election, Even on election day, we'll get the final reports before we get the election results. And nearly like 95, 99% of the vote's going to be in some of these states. It won't be tallied yet and reported,
Right.
but we're going to know how many people have returned ballots. And we're going to know how many people cast in-person early votes. And so like in 2020, once Texas passed its 2016 turnout in just its early vote alone, we knew that we were going to have an unusually high turnout rate in Texas. We knew we had already beaten 2016. We could see this in the all-mail ballot states too. Texas is not an all-mail ballot state.
Right.
So that's why we pay attention, at least I do, to these data, because the best, clearest indicator that we're going to get from the early vote data is turnout projections. And then why does that matter? Like, sorry, I'm going to jump ahead and think about what questions you'd ask. But why does it matter?
You're on the right track.
Like, why does it matter right now? Is that, well, polls have different universes in which they poll. Some are all adults, some are registered voters, some are likely voters. And among those likely voters, there could be a low turnout scenario, there could be a mid turnout scenario, there could be a high turnout scenario. And so if you look at the polling that's going on right now, this is pretty clear and pretty persistent in the polling. Biden and now Harris do better among the likely voters than the registered voters of the all adults. So that more restrictive universe. And there's some good reasons to think of why that may be happening. We can talk about that in a minute. But to go to the point of why turnout matters is that how many people vote will give us a sense of like which of those likely voter models are going to be correct. And there's when you move from those more expansive, like all adults, not all those people are going to vote. Even among all registered voters, not all those people are going to vote. So as you move to this more restrictive universe of people who are likely voters, Harris tends to do better among those. And then we have to think, all right, so like how high will the turnout be? And ironically, it could be, again, lots of moving parts here, but just as sort of a rule of thumb, now it looks like the higher the turnout, it actually could help Trump. So, if we had an unusually like 2020 election again, that could benefit Trump. But again, things have shifted a lot over the last couple of weeks. And so, that's just my impression right now. Yeah. So we'll get a better sense of this as we get more polling. Yeah. So
you raise a thing that I wanted to touch on that you did allude to in the article I was talking about from, I think it's 2020, the turnout gap in surveys, that piece that talked about, these surveys that happen that the Census Bureau and ANES and the General Social Survey do around elections are in part used to help us describe who voters are and who non-voters are. And maybe you can talk a bit about that distinction, how it's commonly understood, and then how it's playing into this sort of likely voter scenario in understanding, a partisan tilt that may exist there.
All right, so there's two parts in answering that question. One is just like trying to understand, like, what are these different universes? The other is who among those universes are the voters. And so that's, why don't I just answer the first one and we can come back to the second question. So, turnout, like, what are these different universes? Back in the late or mid 1990s, Warren Matosky, who is the guy who basically invented the exit poll, asked me to, and I was back in graduate school. So, I'm just a lowly little graduate student. And he asked me to compare the exit poll demographics with demographics from some of these other surveys that you're mentioning. Most importantly among those was the current population survey. It's a survey that is basically the way in which the government calculates our unemployment rate. And then in November of an election year, they ask a few additional questions about voting. And so it's not a real political survey. It's just
Mhm.
like, did you vote? Were you registered? How did you vote? And that's it, not even who you voted for. But that current population survey, voter and registration supplement, that's its full name, it gives us a fairly good read and consistent read on what the demographic profile of the electorate is. And so I was comparing the exit polls to the current population survey. And as I was compiling up all these old past surveys, I started realizing something. Oh, hey, look, to make this good comparison, I have to actually remove these non citizens from the universe of people who are in the current population survey. And I don't mean illegals. I mean,
Mhm.
like people here legally and otherwise. So it's not just illegals. And so as I was doing that, I started realizing, oh, and look at this, the percentage of the non-citizen population is growing, and it's not growing just a small amount. From
Mm.
1980 to about 2000, it grew about 6 percentage points among what we call the voting age population, all everyone age 18 and older. And so I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And boy, I think we need to recalculate turnout rates. And then I did a little bit more digging in, and I was like, oh, wait, and look at this, the ineligible felon population, depending on the state laws, it's been
Mhm.
increasing too. Not as dramatically, but it went from about 1 to 2 percentage points. So it looked like we had this growing ineligible population, and at the time, back in the 1990s, if you looked at op-eds, and there were people like Ivy League professors who were writing books on why turnout rates were going down, and they were trying to explain it. It was like,
Mhm.
it's television, it's bowling alone, I mean,
Right.
it was all of these theories that people were throwing out. It all started with the premise that turnout rates were going down, and actually showed, well, they're not going down. It's just the ineligible population is increasing. Actually, if you take into account that ineligible population, they've remained flat
Mhm.
uh, since basically over the last 100 years. And so here I am again, just a lowly. Now I'm an assistant professor, just trying to make my way in the world. And suddenly I have Ivy League professors attacking me, saying I'm wrong, and because they've written books on this,
Yes.
and they have to protect their legacies and their careers because they this is what they've done.
Mhm.
And I coined the phrase voting eligible population. And if you hear, like, again, if you listen to politicians today, they'll say eligible to vote. They're saying that because of what I did.
Mhm.
I mean, coining that word and giving a way for people to talk about voting in a different way. And uh, so, it's still, again, today that people, well, let me put it this way. One of my colleagues once said, you have the most used, least cited data in academia. And I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's very true. Because once those turnout rates get out in the wild through the media, people will be start crediting them to the Washington Post, the New York Times. It's like,
Mhm.
yeah, but those are my numbers.
Right.
But that's where they show up, and that's where people think they came from.
Yeah, it's very interesting because there is still this persistence of there's a whole bunch of these kinds of data points. I do another project related to generational demographics and how a lot of the headlines that you see about millennials have killed everything they've ever touched and that sort of thing is mostly nonsense. But also that there are these kind of stats that are long expired, like no longer true, and yet we continue to talk about them. An example is like half of all marriages end in divorce, which is not true. It's like if you use the weird calculation that they use to make that, which is how many marriages were there this year and how many divorces were there this year, divide one by the other, that's your divorce rate. At worst, it's like 1 in 3 marriages end in divorce. But but that's also a weird way of calculating that. The other one is the idea that voter turnout is like is like 60% at most or something like that, and it's that is ish true. It is also like well, if you look at registered vote, like the thing that I had looked at a long time ago for one of these things was, to your point and to some of the work you've done, the percentage of registered voters who vote is pretty stable over time. The biggest predictor of voting is being registered to vote, is what it looks like to
Mhm.
me. And so, like, why do you see older people voting more than younger people? Well, some of it might have to do with baby boomers got the vote at 21, and so they were super activated at 21 and started out high and stayed high. That's a story that some people in the generational world want to tell. The other is just like you're more likely to get registered at some point. My dad was famously not registered to vote until he was in his like late 30s, early 40s. And my mother was registered to vote the whole time. Like it just depended on when you got involved. I think these distinctions though, and that distinction between the AP, voter age population, and voter eligible population, the thing you've identified, is a really important one because it does crystallize that everybody who's 18 plus isn't in a country like ours, is not in the population of people that we should be predicting turnout based upon. And yet that's happening in the CPS survey, so they are being included in the total number for calculating the percentage of turnout. Is that a fair characterization of what's happening there?
Well, they actually changed their methodology because of what I
Ah,
did.
okay.
So that's good, right?
Yeah.
When the Census Bureau actually changes what they do. And I've given talks to the Census Bureau about the numbers, and there's some other things going on with the current population survey that
Hmm.
probably need to be fixed, but um, probably won't for various reasons. But yeah, so I think that was a positive development when they started calculating citizen voting age population. And you
Hmm.
also have to understand the current population survey sample frame is non-institutional housing in the country. So prisons are not surveyed for that
Right.
particular survey. And so, although there are ineligible felons who are on probation or parole or have been permanently disenfranchised, they're at least getting part of that segment of the population that are at least in prison,
Mm.
accounting for that when they calculate their turnout rates. But even that aside, the turnout rate, if you actually look at the turnout rate for the current population survey, it's like 10 percentage points higher than what I get for the voting eligible population. And
Right.
there's some weirdness going on there. That's not what they officially report, but you have to look at the data and realize they're doing a little trick there. They count all of the people who did not respond to the voting question
Hmm.
as not voting.
Right.
And that is not really what survey researchers do. They
Right.
usually exclude missing data from their calculations.
Hmm.
And so when you exclude that missing data, the current population survey, just like any other survey that you mentioned, is going to have a pretty severe, what we call vote over report bias. And there are reasons why that could be happening. The the one that is most often cited, although I think there are other things going on there too, is that people like to portray themselves in a positive light when they respond to an interviewer. And so if an interviewer asks you, did you vote or are you going to vote in election surveys, people are going to say, of course I'm going to vote because I'm a good citizen. But maybe they didn't really do it. And again, there are other reasons why that's going on too. But that's probably the main reason why we see this vote over report bias.
Yeah,
And
there were some interesting things in that paper that I thought, because you went through a variety of things that you and your colleagues did about what could be contributing to that turnout gap between what these surveys are showing and then what the actual turnout is. And these 10 plus point gaps in what the surveys suggest and what is actually happening are very, there's a variety of things that make perfect sense. There is that kind of mode effect of, is it face to face, is it over the phone, is it online? Those things all have different layers of, it's a conversation I recently had with a client about a project on my side of the fence, which was the difference between a face to face conversation, a telephone depth interview, and doing something online, even something that would involve self recorded video, for example, of like, where would people be most comfortable talking about this particular topic? And And the nice thing is, like, the Zoom call is an interesting sort of attenuation of, or combination of, the phone experience and the face to face. You're looking at me while we're talking. And this was a project actually about probation and parole, but we were trying to figure out, like, what was the best sort of environment to create for people to feel like they could be honest. They could talk about things in a kind of candid way. So that mode effect is interesting. The other thing that was interesting was just this thing I hadn't given a lot of thought to, which was the both the question wording and the difference between a yes/no response, did you vote or not, instead creating more of a permission structure to say, well, I meant to, but I didn't, or yeah, I usually do, but I didn't. Those kinds of things where they still get to say, like, usually I'm a voter, but I didn't vote this time, or I don't really remember if I voted or not. Having those options creates more permission for people to be truthful about what they did, instead of just an on or off switch kind of a question. Are you seeing changes in the surveys about it? Looked like there had been lots of experiments run, and some places had changed their methods many times over time. But are you seeing a general trend away from the yes/no answer type for this question about voter behavior?
Well, not with the Census Bureau, unfortunately, and that's unfortunate because it's our longest time series on voting. I know the American National Election Study, who one of those co-authors of that paper is one of the guys who runs the National Election Study. They have experimented, and so if you just take a step back, look, one of the things that and this is what I teach my students. I say, I'm going to give you a lecture on polling, and you can, accept this in two ways. One way in which you could process everything I'm about to tell you is that all polls are junk and I should never trust a poll ever again. The other is to be just a more savvy consumer of polls. And you have to understand that pollsters are always changing their methodology. They're always trying to improve, because their job and what they get paid for and what they make their living for is being accurate about what they do. And so they're always tinkering with their polls, and our society is always changing. There's new challenges that people are facing. We know that, for example, response rates on polls for many polls are like down in the single digits. And so it's really hard to survey people. And what do you do about that? Do you use a different method of interviewing? How do you apply weighting schemes and other things of that nature? So people are trying to fix these problems in real time as they arise. And you only get to, one thing about election polling, at least, is that we know what the truth is. I mean, we get the election result. We're able to compare the polls to the election result. And so then that gives a moment of reflection for people to go back and fix what it was, or at least attempt to try to fix it. But the problem is that things are still changing, even while you're trying to fix things. And so all of this is going on. It's a sausage factory, and people who are serious survey methodologists talk about not just random sampling error, just the randomness of that most people are familiar with. They talk about total survey error. It's all of the contributions, the methodology that underpins, not on top of all of the random error that you can get. And so we kind of understand that with the presidential election polling, there's probably like a plus or minus 5 percentage point error when we look at the numbers. But that's not how it's portrayed. I mean, we're back to the same place where we used to be, which is really frustrating because there was this breakthrough moment where we were talking about probabilities and we understood the margin of error. And then suddenly we're looking at some of the same people who were engaged with Nate Silver and the 538 crew. They've gone on to jobs at New York Times and CNN, and they're back to talking about point estimates. And I'm like, what? You guys, come on. That's how you became famous. That's how you got your jobs. And now is to talk about uncertainty. And now we're back to the same thing that we were before, which is talking about, well, here's the estimate. It's like 52 versus 48. And I'm like, dude, like, come on, we need to understand, like, there's lots of things going on here, and we don't really know with a lot of certainty what's going to happen. It's one of the things, again, not to stray too much into politics about it, but I mean, Biden got a bum rap. He really did. And there's a lot of interest and excitement around Harris as his replacement. So, maybe there were some real structural issues that her ascendance to the Democratic nomination have fixed within the party. But if you go back, I mean, there were some good reasons to, like, you just got through a bad debate, you got assassination attempt on Trump, his nomination. And if you really think about where the polls were, they were still saying, like, we don't really know who's going to win. If you were a real consumer of those polls. But people are like, well, I looked at the point estimate, so he's got to go. and again, maybe that is the right way of looking at it. But there was certainly an argument to say, like, his internal polling was probably not showing things as bad for him as the external public polling was. And so for him, it was a hard decision for him to decide that he wasn't going to run for re-election, because he probably seriously thought, and he was probably getting real advice from his polling consultants, to say, oh yeah, you still have a chance to win this. And so what do you do in that situation if you're the president of the United States and you're thinking, like, what should I do if I'm being told privately that I still have a chance? Like, what do I do? Anyhow, I mean, it just goes back to this whole thing. Like, when we look at the polling, I just look at it. I mean, even now with this shift that's happened with Harris, I don't know what's going to happen. We'll get a much better sense when we get into October. But right now, even with this surge that's happened with Harris, it's just a narrow race. And if, again, not to do too much opining about where we are, but we have become so polarized as a country that we've narrowed down the swing voters. And there's a floor and a ceiling for both candidates, and we're going to be within that trading range. And here's the kicker. Unless something really unusual happens, we're going to go into election day with basically the error of the poll predicting, the election could go either way within the error of the poll. That's most likely what's going to happen at this point. Again, conditions could change, something unusual could happen between now and then, but that's most likely where we're going to be when all is said and done.
So this is something I've been thinking a lot about over the last several weeks. We did an episode of last week, I guess it came out, with some folks at a strategy. Well, their real area of expertise is kind of geopolitical strategy. They do a lot of stuff with the Foreign Service and the State Department. And it's a lot of serious games exercises for figuring out how to sense and respond to complex scenarios, right? And the reason I wanted to talk to them was, when you're just looking at poll results that are like tracking steady 2-point difference month after month after month at the national level, and yet there's all this perceived volatility in the swing state polls, or there's so much perceived volatility in some of the underlying numbers about favorability or approval ratings or whatever, that may be like the way to figure out whether or not to replace a candidate in the summer before the election is not through polling. Maybe it's through some other set of sort of strategic exercises to think through the implications and all of that sort of thing. I don't have any evidence that anyone did this exercise, but I wanted to talk to someone who understood how to run one, if someone ever wanted to, as a method of decision making. Because I think there is this desire, and I see it in the way polls are reported upon. And we see it in the work that I do, where clients will look at a survey result and think, well, the data will tell me what to do. And we've almost every time a client says that, we have to kind of call time on the field and say, no, it won't. You will still have to decide what to do. This data is directional, and it gives you a snapshot in time. It tells you some things that are interesting. You can compare it to other data that you've had before, it's there to inform you about the things that matter to you, but you're ultimately going to be the decision maker here. The survey data is not going to make the decision. And I think this is where that kind of reliance on polls as a predictor of what will happen is where I get the most frustrated with coverage of polls, because they want to always include the quote about it being a snapshot in time. But the point of the story is often, not always. Aaron Zittner at the Wall Street Journal talked about using it as a way to understand how the electorate is changing. That seems like a healthy relationship to polls. But a lot of the time it's, well, this is what's going to happen in November based on what we see in March and June and August. And I know that there is also what's his name? Elliot Morris at is that his name? At 538
Yeah.
now, has talked about basically like, forget about polling until after Labor Day. Like all polls before Labor Day are basically pointless, which is
But
a departure certainly from
it.
Nate, right?
Even he'll do it. He'll start falling into the trope of, like, he did this thing about some swing state polls out of one pollster. Like, these are really devastating polls for Biden. I'm like, wait a second, come on, it's one pollster. Mm-hmm. And there's state polls, and we know there's a lot more error in state polls. What are you saying?
And as they think about their kind of prediction models, are they not using some of the data that is generated by some of these past year turnout models to try to model who the likely electorate is going to be and how to weight the results?
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit, because that's really fascinating too. So there, as you're probably well aware, there are some big societal changes that are happening in this world and in our country. And one of those is the growing diversity of this country. Mm-hmm. So if you just look at a plot since 1990, the share of the non-Hispanic white share of the electorate has been steadily decreasing. There's some bumps where in midterm elections, it goes up a little, the share goes up a little bit because of lower turnout, but in presidential elections, it goes back down. So there's kind of this decreasing staircase that's going down, and it's going to continue. There's no way it's not going to continue. Mm-hmm. The demographics of this country that the census is reporting says we're becoming more diverse. Our K-12 are no longer plurality white. There are two states now, Texas and California, that are no longer plurality white. Whites are still, majority white, I should say. They're still the plurality. They're the largest group, but they're not the majority anymore. And by sometime around 2045, 2050, somewhere in there, whites will no longer be the majority in the country. They'll be the plurality. That is happening, that without a doubt. On top of that, as this increasing diversity is happening, it's happening kind of from the bottom up, because these are younger people. I'm not going to traffic in great replacement theory, but it is very true that white people are not having babies at the same rate as other more diverse groups. And so as we see that K-12 population rising, and they're now getting into their 30s or so, we see another dynamic that happens with turnout, which is that the older you are, the much more likely you are to vote. And so it's not only the growing diversity of the country that's going to be pushing down the non-Hispanic white share of the electorate. It's also going to be rising turnout rates for those populations, those diverse populations, as they grow older. Right. So now, and there's also some big education things that are going on too. Older people tend to be whiter. They tend to not have gotten high school education, or college education. They graduate high school, that was it. And good reasons for that. Mm-hmm. My grandfather made a lot of money, had chain restaurants. I wish it was on my dad's side of the family, but it was on my mom's. And but he didn't go to college. He didn't need to. He didn't even graduate high school. So you didn't need to do that to be successful. But today you do, and so more people go to school. Education is highly correlated with turnout, and so we can see that we've got this growing share of the electorate that is more diverse. We're seeing more people going to college. Those two groups tend to be part of the Democratic coalition. They were a little bit shaky with Biden, but Harris, at least if we believe some of the initial polling, seems to have shorn up those groups again. And Republicans rely more upon these, as Trump says he loves them, the lower education whites. And they're older, they're more rural, and they're decreasing as a share of the overall electorate. All right, so we've got all these problems with surveys. We're only like surveying maybe single digits if we're lucky, get to double digits. That's our response rate. So your sample is the people who are actually going to respond to your poll are unlikely going to be like what you think the electorate is going to be. But then what do you think the electorate is going to be? Is a real deep question. Do you think it's going to be the same as the 2020 election? Well, that was a very unusual election, very high turnout rate. It was drawing in some people, unusual, not a big deviation from these trends, but a little bit, and a little bit more non-college white in there, for example. So is that what you do? Do you weight it to that share, what you think that electorate's going to be back in 2020? Well, if you do, you're missing some trends. And maybe you're making a bad estimate based on 2020. And we don't know what the pollsters do. We really don't. This is like their secret sauce. Weighting is it. They slather on that secret sauce and we get some numbers out. And, and there are some polls that just for whatever reason, they tend to be more pro-Democratic or pro-Republican for some reason. Likely it has something to do with that weighting. Will it be correct? Well, we'll know. Once we get closer to the election, we should start seeing a narrowing on these estimates. But CNN and New York Times tend to be the most Republican polls out there, most favorable to Trump. And a lot of our perceptions about like what should be going on and what's happening are based on those two sources because they're such dominant trusted news sources versus other new polling organizations or other news organizations that do polls. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and trying to get this right is difficult. It's not easy to do.
No. And to your point about, we're trying to fix things, but things don't stop and wait while we're trying to fix stuff. And there is a kind of, to look forward, look back kind of process at all times of like, we want to make better predictions. So we want to solve the problems we had last time, whether or not those problems are still the problems that we have. One of the things that as I was looking at a lot of the polling data was should be surprising, should be worth talking about. But of course, once you get past about 55, we stop talking about you. So the older voter groups were much more aligned with Biden in the polling around Biden than you would have predicted, because typically we say the older you get, the more conservative you become. And that isn't necessarily true. And there's a lot of reasons why it'd be less true. And, people are actually responding to the world they live in a lot of the time. So, but that was a story that always felt under-addressed. It would just be this like, old people seem to be liking Biden. And I think sometimes there was this implicit like, well, because he's also old, sort of idea, when maybe it might have to do with things like lowering Medicare prescription drug prices. And, there might be actual reasons why they would do that. And also just that baby boomers are different than their parents' generation when they got to be older. I was joking with a friend of mine. I had a econ teacher. He had a PhD and was sort of in his semi-retirement when I was in high school. And he used to refer to senior citizens as the Gray Panthers and would talk about how they would get into their Buicks and roll down to the polls. And they were just this incredibly reliable voting bloc because they were, in general, at that point in time, this is the early mid 90s, they're retired. They have time on their hands. And they're going to go vote. They're going to go vote to protect Social Security or whatever their local interests are. The other thing, again, growing up in Oregon, that they would reliably do is vote for property tax limitation measures. And that's, of course, how we funded schools. So then you would have generational warfare between the baby boomers and the greatest generation over funding schools. But this is the electorate is constantly changing. The cultural underpinnings of that culture is constantly changing. And the kind of adjusting for the last cycle, which is 2 or 4 years ago, seems like it's not, but I don't know how you would necessarily sense and respond to the way things are changing under your feet. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on how one might go about doing that.
Yeah, it's all secret sauce. I mean, it
Yeah.
really is. I mean, this is an art. It's not a science. I mean, there is science definitely to polling, but there's also an art to it, and an art to being able to interpret what polls tell you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but here's the thing, and here's where I get into it with people like Nate Silver and others, but mostly him, is that I look at something else. I look at early voting. And what I realized back in 2008 was that if I look at for states that have party registration, I can look at the share of the electorate that's Democratic and Republican registered to vote, who
Mm-hmm.
are actually casting votes. Now, party registration is not exactly the same as self-identified partisanship. I don't know how those people are actually going to vote. But when you do a difference in difference approach, where I look at the share in this election cycle and I compare it with the Democratic Republican share in the prior election cycle, and other things haven't changed because there's also changes to election laws and other things that go on. But like a state like Oregon, party registration state with mail balloting, you're going to get a good sense of what the electorate is.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to get relative senses of enthusiasm based on the share of the people who've turned out to vote. And so when we get into October, the last 2 weeks, especially of October before the election, I'll be tracking all of that activity that's happening on early voting. And, it'll be at that moment where we can start seeing, is the early voting administrative data, is that verifying and validating the polling numbers that we're getting? And if they are, then we're like, okay, it's like two different signals telling us the same thing. If they're not, if they're telling us two different things, maybe we should be a little bit more critical, or just a little bit more critical of the polling.
Mm-hmm.
And a place like Florida, for example, has changed its mail ballot laws very fundamentally, and that's going to change some of the dynamics of early voting that's happening in the state. So I'm going to have to be a little cautious in a state like Florida. So difference in difference doesn't work if there's been a change like that. But by and large, it tends to work pretty well. And I think we're going to get a read, in addition to the polls, from those early voting analyses.
The other part of this that is so interesting, and we talked a little bit about this with Andrew Mercer from Pew and with Paul Westcott from L2, one of the voter file providers. And a thing I'm deeply curious about, married to a former Englishman, now an American citizen, but is the popularity of MRP in the polling in the UK this cycle. And then kind of digging into, first of all, I would look at these reports of the polling in the UK and be like, you polled 30,000 people. Talk to me about budgets, because I keep hearing how expensive surveys are in the US. Now, I'm fairly certain that most of their I think they're mainly using online sample providers, but that would drive the cost down significantly. But the other thing that is interesting to me about it is the challenge of, there's just a fundamental difference in the data that we kind of mandatorily collect in the census in the United States versus the British census. And so like we don't collect religious identities, for example, and we ask about it in the community survey. We don't put it on the census, if I have that right. But in the UK, they have kind of a single source of truth about almost every demographic factor you would want to use in modeling an electorate. And we don't. And in particular, what we don't have is everywhere you register to vote, you don't have to select a party that you are affiliated with. And that has implications for how primaries are conducted. But it also means like you're going to have to get appended data, or you're going to have to make some educated guesses. I mean, those are both the same thing in a way. Just one is more educated than without the appended data, I guess, in order to understand precinct by precinct or county by county, however it's divvied up, what the likely turnout's going to be and how that correlates to partisan preference. And so, yes, North Carolina, yay, great state. I think in Oregon you still register by party, but I can't remember now if that's the case. But all of those things make it a real challenge to model turnout, predict outcomes, because you don't have a nice clean data set with all the cells filled out, right? Like
Yeah.
there's some missing data in there at any given point in time.
Yes, I've done a lot of research and criticism of voter file vendors, and I work with them too. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I know the responsible ones are like, yeah, you're right. There are limitations here
Mm-hmm.
about even that data. States are constantly managing their voter lists. They're removing people. Between now and election day, there are going to be millions of people who are registering to vote who are not currently on the voter registration roll. So if you have a New York Times
Mm-hmm.
Siena poll, which is a registration-based sample, guess what? You're missing all those people who are going to register, and they're primarily younger people, more diverse. That's
Yeah.
going to matter. And does that explain why the New York Times poll is like 2 or 3 percentage points to the right of all the other polls when it comes to Trump versus Biden or Harris? It could. I don't know. It could be sort of the weighting scheme. I don't know, but
Yeah.
certainly it's a possibility. Uh, and so and there's a lot of secret sauce here on voter files.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, I've looked at them very deeply, and I could go into the weeds so many different directions with them. But I think the basic thing to know about them is just they're just another slice, and they're an imprecise measure. They're pretty good,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not perfect, and they're just like anything else. Like if we knew the ground truth about anything, then we wouldn't need the polling. We wouldn't need anything, right? We would just know what the ground truth is. But
Right.
that's not how the world works, and so we're constantly struggling trying to understand how the world works with imprecise measures, and trying to understand the strengths and weaknesses of those measures makes you a more savvy person when you're interpreting the estimates that they're telling you about.
Yeah, it's also interesting to think about the interpretation around non-response bias and the report that came out from APOR after the last election of, yes, there's a polling error here, and it doesn't seem to be attributable to the things that caused the polling error last time. And so we non-response bias like seemed to be I don't want to trivialize the report. They really tried to wrestle with it, but the upfront sort of introduction section of it just does feel like it's a non-response, probably. And yet, I think there is also a narrative that has emerged about who it is that doesn't respond to polls, at least from a kind of psychological perspective, and maybe also a political alignment one of these are people who don't trust institutions, they're less likely to vote anyway, they might lean to the right or at least lean populist. But that feels at the moment like speculation, because how do you study a population that won't be studied?
Yeah. Well, one of the fun things that I've been engaged in a couple of research projects on this is to ask people, if they actually voted, and I have their voter registration record. And I can
Mm-hmm.
actually see what they did. Related project that a colleague of mine did here at the University of Florida. He asked, people, how did you vote during the 2020 election? Did you vote by mail? Did you vote in person? Early, and he had the actual record, and he could see all these Trump supporters telling him that oh no, they didn't, they voted in person, but he had a record of them voting by mail. It was in the administrative data. And so we have that dynamic that goes on here where people are providing responses, and how truthful are those responses versus what the administrative records tell us about their what they actually did. And they don't always jive up. And some reasons you could think, well, it's the people telling you something wrong. But on the flip side of it, it's sometimes the administrative records that are telling you something wrong. For example, when we ask people, did they vote? And they say, yeah, I voted. And you look at the voter file and you say, well, there's no record of you voting here in Florida. And then we started asking them some follow-up questions like, oh, so did you vote someplace else? And then they go, oh, yeah, I moved in to the state. And so, oh,
Right.
and like trying to track people as they move across state lines with voter files, because we have all of this is administered at the state level, and we don't have a lot of good data to link records together from different states, and these files themselves are churning. It's a real challenge for these voter file vendors, and they do as best as they can. So I mean, it's a constructive criticism. I'm not trying to say like, don't trust the voter file data, but just to say there's some real challenges here. And that matters when, I don't know, maybe you run a survey and you do a vote validation. You take the survey responses and you try to match people with their administrative record, whether they vote or not. Well, I mean, guess what? In Utah, they allow people to censor their public records. So last time I checked, about a seventh of the registered voters in Utah do not allow the state to release their public record. So I don't know. I mean, you just don't even know for a seventh of the population. And if you look at some of the surveys that election surveys that do this vote validation exercise, you can see that, yeah, there's something squirrely going on with Utah. Well, I know what it is. And how pernicious is that elsewhere when you're trying to match data where you don't maybe only have a name and an age and the address isn't particularly good. And these are thorny things that census is wrestling with, and survey researchers are wrestling with, and voter file vendors are wrestling with, and I'm absolutely certain, because if you look at your Experian or whatever record, you're going to see, oh, wait, that's not even me. And you're going to, that often happens. And it goes down to this very fundamental thing. It's like, it's difficult to actually match data.
Yes.
And I've written about this as well. Like, and you can use, either you can accept that, like it's difficult to match data, or you can realize, oh, I can use that for nefarious purposes, and I can talk about people who vote more than once. Yeah, it's just the same name and birth date.
Right.
Millions of records, that's going to happen. And you know it because if you look at your Experian record or Accenture, whatever, you're going to see something that says, hey, look, there might be somebody with your exact name and birth date. It's probably a pretty good, especially if you're a Robert Smith. There are too many Robert Smiths in the world. So,
right. Yeah, it's funny to think about this. You just made me have a memory of, I was at a conference, this is years ago now, probably 10 plus years ago. And I was putting on a side event and needed to pay the venue hall, and was putting it on the business credit card, and got a call from credit card security because it was like a $5,000 charge or something. And they were like, they put me through this list of questions to do identity verification. And I was like, okay, none of the options you gave me apply to me. So is there a none of the above option? Well, no, one of these has to be right. I was like, none of them are right. I have not lived on any of those streets ever in my life. There was like two questions that I got wrong because whatever their data source was, and I think actually at the time it was LexisNexis, but it was like some other person. And hilariously, you would think that Farah Bostic is not that common of a name, but it's common enough, right? It's common enough for some person living in South Carolina with the same name as me to wind up having cross-referenced file data.
Well, I've got a better example of this. I was on the do not fly list because there's a Michael McDonald from Northern Ireland who is a terrorist. And I share the same birth date as this other Michael McDonald. And so I actually got pulled aside, and had the whole interrogation at an airport. And I had to say, like, that really is not me.
Hmm.
I am not from Northern Ireland. I am not, yeah, that is not me. And so I had to get, one of these appeals where you get a special identifier number, and that has to be associated with my record. So
Oh, great.
I'm not on the do not fly list. I got off of it. But there was a period of time where I
Yeah.
always got the security screening and always got pulled aside. And I just had to build in some time into my travel plans to think that, yeah, I'll probably get flagged again.
Yes, I've known a couple of other people with similar ones where it's like my friend Liam, who's a very pale man from Northern England, who uh, was temporarily mistaken for someone who was on a terrorist watch list or something, but was Nigerian, and it was like really not the same guy, like really identifiably not the same guy. But yeah, had the same birthday, had the same first and last name, and so he had to get that cleared up. This, though, I think becomes a real challenge because it means if you know you're dealing with incomplete data, a certain degree of uncertainty, or an uncertain degree of uncertainty, then you have to do some guessing. You have to do some modeling and some weighting and all of that. I was recently looking at, because I was curious about UK polling, there is something that I think is called the British Polling Society, which has some standards and requirements for anybody who is publishing to the public polling data. They have like a time limit on how long after it's first reported upon that the full like crosstabs and weighting and data set are available publicly. They have to be linked to from the original story. They have to disclose their weights, all of that sort of thing. And as I've been talking to people about modeling and and a variety of other things, one of the criticisms I hear about public pollsters is there isn't a lot of consistency about publishing your weights. Even if you do it, you don't publish a complete set of your weights. It just says how you're weighting, Republicans versus Democrats versus independents, or gender, like big top line kind of the demographic crosstabs. Those weights might be published, but no other assumptions are published, like likelihood to vote or that sort of thing. It's very opaque what their definition of a likely voter is, and everyone's got a subtly different way of defining that. And so, why is this the case? Why are we putting numbers out here that we're asking people to at least believe are plausible, if not actually trust, but not showing our work? Like, what's driving that?
Because someone else will steal your work. I mean, this is all
Because we wouldn't want all the
proprietary.
polls to say the same thing. We have to have some
Yeah,
special
there
take.
actually
Yeah.
is there is some value to that, right? To kind of understand what the breadth of the uncertainty is. I mean, I jokingly do this on social media. I say, choose your own adventure.
Right.
Whenever a new poll comes out and it's different from the other polls, it's like, you know, could that poll be right? Yeah, it could be. Could the other poll be right? Yeah, it could be. Do we average them? Yeah, we could. Do we just add a bad poll with a good poll and we've changed our perception about what's going on with an average? That's possible too. I will give um, 538 now, since Nate left, that credit that they now include transparency as part of their pollster rating. I think that's a positive step that encourages more transparency, and having more transparency helps people who are savvy poll consumers actually understand what's going on and be critical and evaluate what's the meaning of this number. But at the end of the day, no one's going to provide us everything, because that's how they make their money. They want to have their own secret sauce, and their secret sauce hopefully tastes better than the other ones. And so they're not going to tell you what goes into their secret sauce.
Yeah, it's super interesting to think about it from the secret sauce perspective versus the like investment thesis perspective, right? Like I used to do some work with a company that was a emerging markets ETF company, and right, they had different baskets of ETFs that they sold, and each one of them had a different investment thesis about where growth in emerging markets were going to come from. So if you were like, I think the phrase they used was like a backdoor emerging markets investor. You'd invest in Coca-Cola and Unilever because they're going to sell a lot of stuff in India and China and everywhere else, right? But if you want to be, if you believe that the way you get more opportunity in emerging markets is by infrastructure investing, then there were infrastructure funds that you could put your money into. Like there were different kind of beliefs about where growth was going to come from. And it seems like the other thing to do is just like say, this is our belief about what likely voters are. This is our belief about where growth in the turnout is going to come from, or this is our belief where enthusiasm is going to come from, and let people, I suppose then what you're doing is letting everyone pick their favorite frame for which poll they want to believe. I don't know how to square the circle, but it's an interesting problem when we consistently have this conversation about are polls broken? Can you trust them? Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I go back to something I said much earlier, which is that I'm the most used, least cited academic out there. And the thing is, I try to be as transparent as I possibly can. Here's all my data sources. Here's how I do the calculations. You can go back and verify my work, because if I've made an error, I want to know about it. Again, my purpose in part is just so that we have good estimates about turnout and early voting so that we make good decisions on election night, especially with the early voting.
So I have two last questions for you. One is you mentioned earlier the way it has been looking is if you slice down to likely voters that the Democratic ticket was performing better among likely voters than all registered voters or all U.S. adults. What's going on in that number? Why does that appear to be the case?
Well, and this is like where I don't know where we go at this point, because part of that was back around 2010 or so with the Tea Party movement, if you can recall back that far. We started seeing this education reversion happen. Before then, typically whites who did not have a college education were more likely to be Democratic. But right around that time, we started seeing a shift. And then Trump really energized it even more. And so, it's hard to distinguish, was that like a long-term trend that was happening, or is this something that's really unique to Trump? I mean, probably both things were going on. So we know that turnout is highly correlated with education. And if you looked at the most recent polling, we still see that flip on education. But the other thing that was going on is that younger voters were also it looked like there was a big realignment happening, that for whatever reason, they were really attracted to Trump. The more recent poll, and again, this is like, it's hard to understand what's going on here. That was with some polls, like the ones that get the most play in the media, like CNN and New York Times, they were showing this, that there's a shift among young voters and more diverse voters. They're tending to go more towards Trump. And so you look at the lower education plus this group that's younger going to Trump, they both have lower turnout rates. And so the higher education whites would be the people more likely to vote. And so this was what was driving this difference between the likely and the registered or all adults numbers to suggest that the likely voters were more Democratic than these other universes of polling samples. But Harris has changed all that again. And so, but again, just understand, it's not in every poll. And it's just so frustrating. There were some polls that were saying, no, like the Democratic coalition looks like it's always done. So what was going on here? The New York Times and CNN seem to have shifted suddenly. So it suggests to me, well, that wasn't entirely polling methodology. It was really something about what they were doing that they were seeing in their respondents. It's not just polling methodology. There's something else going on there. But now those polls look more like the other polls, at least the preliminary stuff, because we've only been like a week. I know you might post this later on, but as we're talking about this right now, it's only been like a week since Biden withdrew. And so if we see younger voters now moving back over into the Democratic coalition. We know they have lower turnout rates. We know that then, well, we don't know, but it's likely then that the likely voter models will shift. We're not seeing good evidence of that yet because you still have the high education whites that are still part of the Democratic coalition, but it does look like there's been some slippage among older whites
Mm-hmm.
From Biden to Trump, or from Harris really
Mm-hmm.
to Trump. So there's like lots of moving pieces here that are sliding around on the puzzle to try and figure out how it all fits together. So, ask me again in a couple months and maybe I'll have a better sense of what's going on. But it's very possible that we're going to be back into the old world where we say, yeah, the higher turnout actually going to benefit Harris more than Trump. But I still think we need a couple more weeks of the polling to get through it, maybe past the Democratic convention, to really know with certainty. Well, not with certainty, just have a better sense of
Have a better sense of it. Yeah.
where this is all going. So it's hard to answer that question at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, so far when friends of mine have asked me what I think of, how Harris is doing, I'm like, I'm not going to look at any polls until I don't know, the week of the convention. I mean, I will, obviously it's part of what I have to do for the show, but I'm not going to take a lot of, I'm not going to put a lot of stock in them. I know.
The narrative will not end, it waits for no man. So,
yes.
How that narrative gets played out. And, there's just I don't know. We're definitely in a different time. The social media is really remarkable around Harris. And that it's happening in a way that I don't think people have really a good grasp on what's going on here yet. But maybe we'll start seeing it. I mean, there was the Ipsos poll that came out that showed enthusiasm skyrocketing for Harris. It's likely related to all the social media. And it, is this finally the death of traditional media, and we're going to see the ascendance of social media, really ascendance. This is going to be the way that we get in the future, how we talk to people. Maybe we're at that inflection point. We're just seeing it happening right now. Again, maybe not. We have to see what happens with the election.
Yeah. We'll have to see how it all pans out in the end. I guess my last question for you is if you could construct, something like the British Polling Society's sort of guidelines for how polls get reported publicly. I mean, acknowledging at the very least, we'd want an attribution requirement, right? But what would make this type of the kinds of polls that we have available to us more useful to you as you think about modeling turnout? What would make you feel like you knew what you were looking at, you could make sense of it, you could rely on it as you also pull precinct level data and other sorts of sources from the administrative record?
Well, the number one thing I want to know is what they think their turnout rate's going to be. Because what pollsters do is they have an idea of what the turnout is, and they're going to weight the poll in such a way that they're going to get to that target turnout number. So that's number one. The other one I want to know is what's their sense of what the electorate's going to be? What's their target numbers for the demographic profile of the electorate? So what's their age, gender, race, Hispanic ethnicity? Those are typical ones. Education could be in there as well, and other weighting schemes. Education, as it turns out, we may have been under polling lower education people for whatever reason. At least that's a common possibility that's raised. But I'm almost certain that the pollsters have tried to fix that. But have we overcorrected on it? This is what the New York Times and CNN polls do. They weight on education as well. But I'd like to know what that looks like. And because I know there are some big trends that are happening in our society, and I need to know, Are they waiting back to the 2020 number?
Mm,
Like what is, so are we properly picking up that trend?
hmm.
Or are we still looking in the rearview mirror? Because that trend could be worth a percentage point or two.
Right.
And hopefully it's not. You hope that it's not, but it could be because the trends. Again, I'm not. There've been like all these like people who say the growing Democratic majority and that sort of stuff. I mean, if anything we know is that parties in the big history of this country, they always adjust.
Yeah.
So I don't think demographics are destiny. But given the current status of where the coalitions are, party coalitions, it seems to me like that would be something really important to know is like, what do we think the composition of the electorate is going to look like demographically?
Hmm.
So those are the two things that I would wish.
What is your Substack? How do people find your work?
It's just like Michael McDonald, so it'll be their election project, U.S. elections project. And once I get into the early voting period, I'll post some of my analyses on early voting
Great.
there. So
We'll put a link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, some of it's open, some of it's for subscribers. So
right.
Hit that button, mash that subscribe button.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for taking the long time to talk to me. You've been very generous with your time, and we've covered a lot of topics.
I could talk about all this.
I can see that. No, this is fantastic, and I may come back to you with a different set of topics for us to discuss. I know I'm doing that with. I talked to Ray Block about his belonging and allegiance work, but I also want to talk to him about truth decay, the stuff he's doing at Rand, and there's just a lot of things. Interesting people are interested in a lot of things and have a lot to say. So I'm sure I will be back in touch. But this was amazing. Thank you for the time today.
It was great talking with you.
Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farrah Bostic, production by The Difference Engine, and edited now by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly Substack, also available at crosstabspod.substack.com. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, and give the show a rating or review. I would love to hear from you, and it will help other people find the show. Email me if you have any questions, ideas for episode topics, suggestions for future guests, or want to talk about ways we can work together at farrah@crosstabspodcast.com. See you next time.